Washington, D.C., the Mutual Broadcasting System presents The Larry King Show, America's favorite talk program. The Larry King Show features interviews with interesting guests from around the world and telephone calls from across North America. Larry King is on vacation this week. Sitting in tonight is Mutual's Dirk Van.
And thank you very much, Paul Henderson. And we've got an exciting evening for you. My sources tell me we have a wonderful, provocative guest tonight, investigative reporter Jack Anderson, syndicated columnist, broadcaster, Pulitzer Prize winner, and now novelist. Jack's new book, Control, a thriller about the frightening prospect of subversion of our mass media, and an investigative journalist who catches wind of the scheme. How does it feel to be a novelist, Mr. Anderson?
It was a compelling story that needed to be told. Sometimes investigative reporters know things that they can't write. And it's very frustrating because you've got to be able to prove it. You've got to be able to back it up. But sometimes you know it's true, but you can't prove it, or you can't, for some other reason, print it. Mm-hmm. And that was the situation I was in. So I decided to try fiction, to be able to tell the story without really naming names and giving the correct details. The story's fictitious. The characters are fictitious, but the premise is absolutely true.
The underlying theme is on target, huh?
The underlying theme is factual.
Well, that's kind of scary, is it not?
Yes, it is. It's happening to us in every field, but it gets particularly scary when it happens to us in the media, because it's the media that influences public opinion, and it's public opinion that rules America.
Well, what is the premise exactly?
Well, the premise is, as part of the takeover of America by foreign interests, that there are those... Look, America is the juiciest prize in the world. It is the number one prize in all the world. And there are alien and hostile interests that would like to be able to influence policy here. And in this country, the people are the sovereigns. It's the people who really do, in the end, determine what our policies are. The politicians keep an ear to the ground. That's why we see all these polls. It's their way. They use polls, and they use statisticians, they use researchers, they use psychiatrists and everybody else to make sure that they're listening, that they're hearing what the public wants them to do. Now, if some alien interests could influence the public, could influence public opinion, they could influence U.S. policy. And this is what, the attempts are being made. And because the attempts are being made, I thought I would write a story, a warning, an alert.
Alien interests. Are you talking about a grand scheme here, or is this just isolated?
It's not isolated. It's not isolated. No, I'm talking about a neo-Nazi scheme. I use neo-Nazis in the story. That part is true. The group that I'm talking about is neo-Nazi. I have different facts and different names, but it is a neo-Nazi scheme, and they would like to influence policy in this country. And they are trying to influence policy in this country, and in actual fact, they do have a publishing empire already, and they hide it. But there are others that prove that it can be done, people who are benign, like Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch is, there's nothing improper or hostile or subversive about his operation, but it does show you that a foreigner can come in and take over a media empire, build a media empire in this country.
Well, of course, there isn't anything hostile about Rupert Murdoch, the Australian entrepreneur that has become a media conglomerate.
No, there's nothing. I just mentioned him to show you that it can be done. But in his case, there is certainly nothing subversive about his operation. There is something subversive about another operation. And it's an operation that I find difficult to talk about because I have problems proving it and because it costs too much to litigate.
Thus the novel form.
That's why I chose fiction. I think that the American people need to know that there's a problem out there. And it's part of the overall picture of America for sale. There's a for sale sign up on America. You know, our forebears cleared the wilderness. They crossed mountains and rivers and deserts to build this country. And now we, their descendants, are selling it off a piece at a time.
And you're convinced this is not sensationalist, this is substance, what you're talking about?
Oh, the selling of America, the media, the attempt to influence policy is all too real. The selling of America, 46% of downtown Los Angeles is foreign-owned. 39% of downtown Houston is foreign-owned. I was strolling with my wife last year in Honolulu. I suddenly looked around at what I saw, and I said to my wife, I said, if Rip Van Winkle were a modern man and had gotten hit on the head with a piece of shrapnel on December 7th, 1941, and just woke up now and looked around and saw what we saw, he'd say, my God, we lost the war because of the tremendous Japanese influence in Honolulu. There are those who say that this is good for America. But the ones who are saying it are those who are working for the Japanese yen or the British pound. These foreign investment means foreign intervention. There's no way out of that. It means control, which is the reason I chose that as the name of the novel.
Would you have commercial buildings and interests in America for Americans only?
No, you
would
can't.
You go to the other extreme?
No, you can't do that. I'm not in favor of setting up artificial barriers. I just want the American people to know. If I were to choose the legislation that ought to be passed, I would say we should treat each nation as they treat us. If a nation restricts American investments, we should restrict their investments. If they give us a wide open door, if Japan treated us the same way we treat them, I would be satisfied. That isn't the case. They restrict us while we give them an open door. And, I would settle for that kind of legislation. What worries me, as I said, is control. Economic decisions are being made that affect the welfare of the United States. These kind of decisions are being made in London and in Tokyo and in other countries. The financial center of the world is long since, the financial capital of the world, long since moved from New York City to Tokyo. It's a question of control. It's a question of intervention, and this does trouble me.
Foreign investment and control in America. How big a threat? Our guest is investigative reporter Jack Anderson. We'll be back after these messages.
You're listening to The Larry King Show tonight with Mutual's Dirt Van. And now, back to Dirt.
He's provocative, controversial, investigative reporter Jack Anderson, our guest on The Larry King Show. And, Jack, you're a very busy man. You just completed a huge project, the investigation into the assassination of John F. Kennedy. What kind of reaction have you gotten to that?
Well, we got a little over 405,500 telephone calls, people paying for the privilege of calling, asking that this chapter in history be reopened, be rewritten. And about 6,500 saying, let the dead lie, don't reopen it. So I'd say it was a tremendous reaction, probably one of the biggest reactions in television history.
And you feel Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone. Give us the story as you see it. If you could, briefly. I guess I'll ask you to oversimplify.
Well, let me try to. It's to understand it, you really have to go back to the Bay of Pigs. That was a CIA operation. And as part of that operation, Allen Dulles, then the CIA director, proposed liquidating Fidel Castro in order to remove this charismatic Cuban leader. They thought the rebels would stand a better chance if if Fidel Castro wasn't there to rally the troops. The CIA then looked for somebody to do the job. They chose the Mafia because the Mafia had the motive and the means. The motive, well, Castro had booted the Mafia out of Cuba, had closed the gambling casinos, had shut off this lucrative source of income. The means, the Mafia controlled the Cuban underworld, which was still left behind intact, and it was populated with some very nasty people, including some killers.
Let me just ask you, Jack, how do you know that? How do you know that the CIA enlisted the help of the Mafia? That's certainly not common information.
No, the Senate... I broke the story. I broke the story many years ago. That part of the story I broke, and a Senate committee investigated it. It was a committee... chaired by the late Senator Frank Church. They took testimony, they subpoenaed witnesses, and they subpoenaed records. And what I just told you is totally confirmed, completely confirmed with documentation, sworn testimony. So once the CIA decided, once they got the Mafia, once they recruited the Mafia, they were using a man named Santo Trafficante. He headed the Cuban underworld. He was the one who selected the hit. He's the one who knew who would be best for this kind of a job. And they sent 6 hit teams to knock off Castro. All 6 failed. All 6 disappeared. And that aroused the CIA's suspicions, and they conducted an investigation, professional hitmen, they may miss once, even twice, but they're not going to miss. They're not going to fail 6 times. There was something wrong. They conducted an investigation, and I don't know. I've seen only references to sources in Cuba. But they concluded from those sources in Cuba that they had been double-crossed by Santo Trafficante. That he was tipping off Castro, and that Castro had been waiting for these hit teams. Santos Trafficante, they found out, he had been jailed by Castro and his casinos closed, but he had been released shortly afterwards. He had made a deal with Castro. He was released, and all of his money was returned to him, and he sailed out of Cuba in his own yacht. So when the CIA found that out, they cut the mafia out of the plot, but they continued the operation. And so Castro no longer had Trafficante to tip him off, to alert him, and yet the CIA was still out to get him. He didn't know when, where, or how they were going to strike. So he issued a public warning. This is on the record, a public warning. And he worded it, these are almost his exact words as translated into English. He said, the CIA has been attempting to assassinate Cuban leaders. He didn't name himself. He said, if these attempts continue, then American leaders will not be safe. He said, this is a game two can play. So the warning went unheeded. The CIA continued its efforts. And 2 months after that, John F. Kennedy was gunned down in Dallas.
So Fidel Castro sent the mob, if you will, out after Kennedy?
That is exactly what happened. That is what sources who were involved told me, and that's what the CIA reported back to Lyndon Johnson, the new president, 2 mornings after the assassination.
How'd you find that out?
I found it out from my own sources and confirmed it with people who had talked to Lyndon Johnson. They talked to Lyndon Johnson some years afterwards. Howard K. Smith was one of those sources. Some I can name, some I can't name. Howard K. Smith is a very respected, responsible television journalist. And he was talking to Lyndon Johnson, and they got on the subject of the assassination, and suddenly Lyndon Johnson just blurted out, Kennedy tried to get Castro, but Castro got Kennedy first.
Well, why did the Warren Commission conduct exhaustive research, and or we are told exhaustive research, and determined that there was no conspiracy?
Well, Lyndon Johnson couldn't afford to let it out. See, he was told 2 mornings after he became president, he was told that the plot to kill Castro had backfired, and that this had triggered the assassination of John F. Kennedy. If he announced that, it would have inflamed American opinion. It would have inflamed the American public. They would have demanded retaliation against Castro.
So you're saying that the Warren Commission is a blue ribbon cover-up, then?
Oh, yeah. I'm explaining why. If Lyndon Johnson had good reasons. If Lyndon Johnson had put this out, he would have been forced to take action against Castro. And Castro had a treaty with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was headed by Nikita Khrushchev, and Nikita Khrushchev had just been humiliated. He had just been forced to back down over the Cuban Missile Crisis. And everyone, intelligence, State Department, were warning the president that he wouldn't back down twice, that he was in trouble at home for having backed down the first time, that he was impulsive, that if you backed him into a corner, that he could become very dangerous. And so Lyndon Johnson really did believe that this could cause World War III. And so he put together a commission. I'm sure that he didn't confide in the commission. But you see, the commission members, who are dignified, honorable, men of integrity and honor, the commission members didn't do their own investigating. They got their information from the FBI. And I know, I've seen some of the documents, I know the FBI withheld from the Warren Commission all information having to do with this plot that backfired, this Cuban plot that backfired.
Who killed JFK and why? We're talking it over with investigative reporter Jack Anderson back after these messages.
Now, back to the Larry King Show from Washington, D.C. Larry is off tonight. Sitting in is Dirk Van.
And our guest is Jack Anderson. Jack, with I must say, controversial theories about the death of a beloved president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. It was 25 years ago this month, November 22nd.
I don't really look upon it as a theory. I started out believing the Warren Commission. I knew Earl Warren, and I didn't think he would ever be a party to any kind of cover-up because I had great faith in his integrity. I also thought that anyone shrewd enough to ambush the President of the United States would not be foolish enough to use a mental misfit, a loner, a crackpot, like Lee Harvey Oswald. I have now concluded from the evidence that's been presented to me that that's the reason they used him. They needed the perfect fall guy, and Lee Harvey Oswald was the perfect patsy.
Well, Jack, a lot of people have written and made a lot of money, I might add, about conspiracy to murder JFK. Mark Lane, Henry Hurt, Robert Sam Anson, just to name a few. David Bellin, counsel of the Warren Commission, calls these people assassination profiteers.
I agree.
What's your reaction? Yeah?
No, I agree. Mm-hmm. I agree, and one of my greatest concerns is that I would be lumped with all of these people. I just, I gather facts. How do I get the facts? I get them through credible sources. And I'm a professional newsman. I don't accept wild theories. I'm not interested in wild theories. I don't speculate on wild theories. I get facts, and the facts I don't accept as facts unless the witnesses are credible or unless I have documentation. And I'll put my documentation up against the Warren Commission's before any impartial jury in this land, and they're going to vote 12-0 in favor of the evidence that I lay before them. Because
Are you going to do that?
Oh, I hope I can do that, because the evidence that I have is far more compelling than the evidence that the Warren Commission presented.
Are you going to try to persuade President-elect Bush to look at your...
Yes, I am. I'm going to let him know how many people want him to do this, that this is the will of the people, that they clearly want to know what the facts are, and they're entitled to know. They want history to be set straight. And I'm going to tell him this. But you've got to remember that George Bush once headed the CIA. And I don't think he's going to be very receptive to it. But, now that he's president, maybe we can get to him. Maybe we can influence him. I'm going to try.
We got a break for news and information. Back with Jack Anderson shortly. We're talking control of America's media and the assassination of JFK. Fascinating stuff, so don't go away. Stay with us. This is the Larry King Show. I'm Dirk Van, filling in for the vacationing Larry King, and this is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
This is the Larry King Show, live from Washington, D.C. Sitting in for Larry tonight is Dirk Van.
And fascinating investigative reporting on the assassination of a beloved president, JFK. Our guest is Jack Anderson. You mentioned, Jack, that you're going to bring the evidence that you have to the attention of Vice President Bush, soon to be President Bush.
Well, I don't know whether he'll accept the evidence. I'm certainly going to offer it to him. But what I am going to do is tell him how many people want this doing. And I'm going to urge him to appoint an impartial panel, a new commission, to set the historical record straight. It's been 25 years now. I think that enough time has elapsed to straighten out history.
When you did the TV show on JFK's assassination and your findings, what kind of response did you get? Most of the people were prepared to go along with your theory or your information?
I simply gave them what evidence I could. Mm-hmm. It's pretty hard to do that in a 20-year investigation, to condense it into a 2-hour television special. But I presented the information. I invited them to respond. It cost them 50 cents apiece to respond. I had way over 405,000 who said they wanted to reopen history. I had about 6,500 who said that they would prefer to let the Warren Commission findings stand. So I would say the vote was overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. And your next step with this? Have you written about this and gone on radio with it in addition to your TV special?
I will be. I'll be writing a little more about it, and I will... and I'm going to take it to the president, the new president. I'm going to take it to George Bush. I'm going to tell him that this is something the people want, and that I think that history should be accurate. And, well, that's all I'm interested in. I'm not trying to stir up anything. I haven't written the book. I'm not trying to make money off of it. I am just trying to set the record straight. And I'm one who believed for 5 years that the Warren Commission was right. I had great faith in the Warren Commission, so I wasn't looking to upset that faith. I wasn't looking I wasn't trying to stir up any problem, but when the information came to me and I investigated it, I have an obligation to tell the American people what I found out.
We have a great many calls for Jack Anderson. We'll be getting to your call shortly. The number to call is 703-685-2177. We have fascinating information for you tonight on the assassination of a beloved president, JFK. Our guest is Jack Anderson. And get your call in now for Jack. The number is 703-685-2177. We'll be back right after these messages.
He asked me if I'd read Nikita Khrushchev's Wars of Liberation speech. I said I never heard of it. So he asked Evelyn Lincoln, his secretary, said, hey, get a copy of that Wars of Liberation speech. I want Jack to read it. Well, I came back later, and he asked me if I'd read it. I said I had. He says, that's Nikita Khrushchev's Mein Kampf. He's telling us what he's going to do. And what it was about was the stirring up wars of liberation, as the Soviets called them, insurgency all over the globe. And he said, this is a war of the future. He says, the only way we can fight it is to have the best counterinsurgency force on Earth. And he said, we shouldn't be fighting the battles. We should just be training our allies how to fight their own battles. But it's not going to be World War II. He says it's going to be counterinsurgency. That's what we have to know. I think he was absolutely right.
Okay, let's go to Berkeley, California. Hi, your call for Jack Anderson.
Jack Anderson, you're a very interesting man, and respectfully, I have to tell you that you've missed the boat here. If you take a look at the Warren Commission, the people that set Oswald up and completely surrounded him and kind of patsied him to the commission, there were 4 Nazis, Mike and Ruth Payne and George de Mohrenschildt. George de Mohrenschildt was a convicted Nazi.
Okay, sir. Let me suggest that you put your comment to Jack in letter form. We don't have time for it now, okay? Thanks very much. We'll go to Sarasota, Florida. Hi.
Well, that last call had to be from California. Mr. Anderson, I was a great admirer of Drew Pearson, and I'm a great admirer of you, of yourself.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
May I ask you, in view of the fact that Associated Press is owned by the Mexicans, and as you said...
it's not Associated Press, United Press, but I know what you mean.
Yeah. And what would be so far-fetched about the Russians coming in here and hiring some ex-senators to buy up our media for them? Now, the state of Florida is sending up a wholly Japanese-owned senator, this Connie Mack. He took $300,000 from the Japanese car dealers in this last election and put him over the top by 28,000 votes.
Don't you think that's a little far-fetched to say that he's owned by anybody?
Well, for $300,000, I think you can buy a senator for that in view of some of the investigations you've done. But my question is this. I don't think it would be stretching your imagination too much to say that the Russians could come in here and use dummies to buy up the American media with these nickel snatchers.
Well, that's the reason that I wrote the book, that these things are possible. I certainly have no evidence that the Russians have done this. I do have evidence that some neo-Nazis have done it, or have tried to do it, and have succeeded on a limited scale, let me put it that way. But the fact that it could happen, yes, I have to agree, and that's the reason I wrote the book.
We go to Ontario, Windsor, Ontario. Hi, come on in.
Hi, I'd like to ask Mr. Anderson in regard to the 3 vagrants that were picked up out in Dallas immediately after the assassination, one resembling E. Howard Hunt, whether those people were ever fingerprinted and whether you believe E. Howard Hunt was involved in it.
Well, I talked to E. Howard Hunt about it, and he swore that he was here. We had some technical experts, the same ones the government uses, checked the photo against the photograph of E. Howard Hunt, and they said it was the same man. I'm not sure it is. I think it could have been a man that just resembled E. Howard Hunt. On the other hand, Lee Harvey Oswald did write a letter to a Mr. Hunt, and the letter did refer to coming to Dallas and to talking about something mysterious. But no, I'm not ready to accept that E. Howard Hunt was in Dallas that day. He says he's got 3 witnesses and that they put him in Washington on that day.
Why did Ruby kill Oswald?
Well, the Mafia could not ever allow it to be known that it had part in that assassination. They had to silence whoever could lead the authorities back to the Mafia. And so the original plan was to eliminate Lee Harvey Oswald. The only problem was that the police got to him first. Lee Harvey Oswald didn't come home that day, that dreadful day. He went to a movie, and the police got him before the mafia could. At that point, he's down in the basement of the Dallas police station. They still had to eliminate him. How are they going to do that? Well, who is going to be crazy enough to go into the basement of the Dallas police station in front of 70 armed officers, pull a gun, and shoot their prized prisoner? You got to be nuts to do that. Well, Jack Ruby did it, and Jack Ruby was not crazy. Jack Ruby came out of the Chicago underworld. He was a sleazy nightclub operator. He said he did it out of love, out of patriotism, out of love for John F. Kennedy.
And the family, right?
Sleazy nightclub operator. It doesn't wash. It isn't true. He did it because he was under great pressure, tremendous pressure, compelling pressure from the mob.
Atlanta, Georgia, your question for Jack Anderson.
Mr. Anderson, I'm sure that you have explored the overlap between the Mafia and the Central Intelligence Agency. The other night on National Talk Radio, it was asserted that your TV show was a part of a disinformation campaign by the CIA using you as a respected journalist to thwart any investigation on their participation in the assassination of the president. A week before President Kennedy was assassinated, he had ordered all U.S. personnel out of South Vietnam and to stop supporting this fascist regime. I think that their sympathies, the CIA's sympathies with that regime, whether it be in Central America or the Philippines or the Dominican Republic or Mozambique or Angola, is widely known.
Well, what's your question, sir?
Well, is it disingenuousness or disinformation?
No, of course, anybody who knows my record, anybody who knows the many battles that I've had with the CIA, I think I'm the only American that the CIA has ever investigated here in the United States. The reason that they did that was because I was alarming them, I was troubling them, I was disturbing them, and it was against the law for them to do it. But they took a chance, and they had me under surveillance. They called it Operation Mud Hen. It's a matter of record. Anybody who said that simply does not know what they're talking about.
Let's go to Alabama, Mobile. Hi.
Briefly, and thank you. Jack Anderson?
Surely.
Statement or two, and one question I would like for you to really give me a good answer for.
Go ahead, ask the question, ma'am.
Okay. Use the term control. I agree with that. I want to add with that, divide and conquer is control. Now, my question is this. The district attorney there in New Orleans.
A man named Garrison.
Those folks, call the names. This is what I wish to know about. And those other folks that jump out of windows, etc., belabor that person, the district attorney. What happened to him?
Garrison is a district judge, I believe, or a state judge, not a federal judge, a state judge in New Orleans now. And, yes, I think he was on the right track. He just never followed it far enough.
Let's go to St. Louis. Hi, your question for Jack Anderson.
Mr. Anderson, my question relates to our budget deficits and our growing reliance on foreign capital. In addition to our current budget deficits, we now read that over $65 billion will be needed in order to deal with insolvent savings and loans. And we also read that the big billions will be required to rehabilitate government weapons plants. So, Mr. Anderson, given the new president's position on no new revenues, and if we add to all of what I've said, add to that our need to borrow to fund our trade deficits, how in the world will our new president and the Congress manage to free us from our growing dependence on foreign capital?
The only thing I can think of would be a Bush miracle. A Bush miracle that would have to surpass the Dukakis miracle in Massachusetts. It just about can't be done.
A tax hike, perhaps?
I don't see how it can be done without increasing revenue, because everything that the caller said is true. There is a good likelihood over the next 4 years that there could be a multi-billion-dollar failure of savings and loan. There's several of them that are operating on the fringe now, some of them that should have been closed by now. The government doesn't close them because they simply can't afford to bail them out. And so they let them operate, and they ought not even to be operating. No, we have a financial crisis. Look, right today, it's smooth sailing. The economy is robust. The unemployment's the lowest it's been in 15 years. Peace prospects are bright. Smooth sailing. But if you cup your hand to your ear, you can hear a waterfall up ahead.
Well, we got a tremendous debt service that we're paying off every day.
No question about it. Now, if there is no emergency, if all we have to do is reduce the deficit as it stands today, yes, I think it's possible without raising taxes.
Would you be willing to gamble on doing that over a longer period of time?
I think right now that it would be possible. I think it would be possible because I happen to be co-chairman with Peter Grace of the Grace Commission, which investigated waste in government. And we found enough waste in government that if we could eliminate it, we could balance the budget. It would be possible to balance the budget without raising taxes just by eliminating the waste. We have proved that. We can prove it to anyone. And, the problem is that this hurts the bureaucracy. This takes money away from the bureaucracy, and they aren't willing to tighten their belt. Whenever you ask them to sacrifice, they say, no, you sacrifice, they say to the taxpayers. They want to cut out our mail deliveries. They want to take food out of the mouths of the hungry. They don't want to give up their studies and their committees and their perks and all the other things that bureaucrats spend money for.
We're talking about financial crises, control of America's media, and the assassination of JFK with Jack Anderson. And we'll be back right after these messages.
Now, back to the Larry King Show from Washington, D.C. Larry is off tonight. Sitting in is Dirt Van.
And we go to Santa Barbara, California. Your question for Jack Anderson.
Yes. Well, hi. First, I'd like to say I saw the program on the assassination that you had on TV.
Thank you.
In the last couple of weeks. A lot of very interesting information. But I have to tell you that when you come down to the final point of saying that the people who committed the crime were acting on behalf of Castro, I find it preposterous, given the fact that there were so many other people involved, ranging from disaffected right-wing people in the CIA to the Cuban exile community right-wing with their long-standing mafia connections, who I think would have had much more sway, shall we say, over the people who committed the crime. I can't really believe that these people acted on behalf of Castro.
There are a lot of strange people who are wandering around, and there's a lot of misinformation that's out. All I can tell you is that these are the facts that I've collected. These are facts that I've checked. It comes from credible witnesses who sat in on it, and I can tell you that this was the conclusion of the CIA. The CIA reported this to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, who certainly had access to all the available information, believed what the CIA reported. I don't know who the CIA sources were. I only know that they had sources in Cuba. I don't know who they were. But I do know this is that the plot that I've described is the same one that the CIA reported. And I have talked to two people who were involved. One, a mobster, who told me many things that only a participant could have known, many things that didn't come out until later. You test a person's credibility that way. The other was a legendary police officer, an undercover man, who actually sat in on some of the hearings, or some of the secret meetings. Now, these people are telling me the same thing, and I have CIA sources who've given me bits and pieces of it. I've put this together, and all of these other names and all of these other conspirators that you've heard about are probably not even involved. A traumatic thing like the killing of a president brings people out of the woodwork to report things that they believe that they knew, or they believe they saw, or they believe they heard, or maybe even did hear or see that had nothing to do with the actual plot. I can assure you that the mafia is not going to involve all of the characters that you're talking about.
Well, Jack Anderson, your charges are serious. You're talking about a cover-up on a grand scale, a government cover-up of something that happened. How open should government be? Well, is it a question of national security? If you're right, and if these facts were covered up.
Well, I think that Lyndon Johnson believed it was a question of national security. If he had announced that to the world, particularly to the American public, that Fidel Castro was responsible for the murder of the President of the United States, it would have created an international crisis that Lyndon Johnson had good reason to believe could result in war. So I do understand why he acted as he did. And if I had been president in the same situation, I'm not too sure I wouldn't have done the same thing. But it's 25 years now. I think the time has come to set the record straight.
Castro's down there. What would he have to say about it?
Oh, Castro has denied this. This charge has been made. I tried to see him for this TV special. I used both back channels and open channels. I went to his representative here in Washington and asked for an interview, and I used some back channels. some people that have access to him. He wouldn't talk to me.
It would be in his interest, I would assume, to continue the...
Look, he is going... Obviously, he's going to deny it. He's not going to admit it. The CIA is not going to want it known. The FBI, which played a role in covering it up, is not going to want it to be told. But I happen to have some of the documents from the FBI showing that they did know about it and proving that they did not tell the Warren Commission about it. And, of course, the CIA story, that was confirmed by a Senate committee.
In your opinion, Jack, does the government routinely cover up things of a smaller nature? How open is our government?
Well, I think it's more open than most governments. It's a little bit like individuals, because government is made up of individuals. And I know if I do something that is that I don't want the public to know about, I'm going to be a little guarded in what I admit. It's just human nature. If something embarrassing happened to you, you're not going to want to get on the housetop and shout it to the world. You'd rather hide it. And that's true of government and the people in government. They're human, and they do the same things that we outside of government do.
We'll be taking more of your calls for Jack Anderson following the break for news and messages. 703-685-2177 is the number. Get the call in now. Our topics, control of the media and the assassination of JFK.
Live from Washington, D.C., it's the Larry King Show, a presentation of the Mutual Broadcasting System. The Larry King Show is taking your calls now at 703-685-2177. That's 703-685-2177. Larry King is off tonight. Sitting in is Mutual's Dirk Van.
Who killed JFK and why? Our guest is investigative reporter Jack Anderson, and we're taking your calls right now. Let's go to Long Island. Hi, come on in with your call.
Hi. I agree with you, Mr. Anderson, about the Japanese economic warfare that they carry on against us. But I also would like to know how you feel about the activities of the most powerful lobby in this country, the pro-Israeli lobby. I've heard that because of it, congressmen are terrified to vote against anything for anything less than total support of Israeli policy.
Now, the Israeli lobby is very powerful. The Japanese lobby is gaining in power. There are 152 Japanese companies that now employ lobbyists in Washington. None of them are Japanese. These are prominent Americans working for the Japanese yen. They spend more money. There's about $100 million that they're spending on lobbyists to influence U.S. policy. So the Israelis, though, I think are probably more powerful in Washington on Capitol Hill than any other foreign lobby. The Japanese, I would put them next. And economic war, yes. I think you called it right. I think history may very well show that World War III turned out to be an economic war, and I'm afraid we're losing it.
Jack Anderson out with a new book. It's a novel, a first for Jack. It's called Control. It's a thriller about the prospect of subversion of our mass media and an investigative journalist who catches wind of the scheme. Jack has also recently completed a special on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and his findings are that, controversial findings, obviously, that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone. And we'll take more of your calls. Let's go to Kansas City, Missouri. Hi, come on in.
Yeah, hello, Jack. I've been a great fan of you over the years.
Thank you.
2 questions for you. I'll ask them and then hang up. One, how many gunmen actually were there in that area? And 2, did the Kennedys have a prominent role in the death of Marilyn Monroe? Thank you.
The answer to the last question first, I have absolutely no evidence that the Kennedys had anything to do with the death of Marilyn Monroe. The number of gunmen, my sources say 3 mafia hitmen were involved. Now, whether my sources don't know how many were actually on the scene at the time, but 3 3 of them got the assignment. And how many of them actually participated is something that my sources do not know.
Well, the Warren Commission report states that Lee Harvey Oswald was in the Texas Book Depository.
Acting alone.
And that the shots all came from his gun.
Again, my sources dispute that, and my sources are very persuasive. And my sources are in a good position to know, and I'll put that evidence up against the evidence of the Warren Commission. When you look at Lee Harvey Oswald, it looks phony in the beginning. Here is a man who posed with the fatal rifle. Then he leaves it behind for the police to find, along with 3 empty cartridges. He may as well have left a signed confession. Lee Harvey Oswald, yes, he was neurotic, but he wasn't stupid. This man spoke fluent Russian, and he had been assigned to an intelligence unit because of his high IQ by the Marine Corps. Now, either he wanted to be discovered or somebody set him up, and I don't know which. All I know is that he was involved in a conspiracy, and I know that not from personal knowledge, but from what very credible sources have told me, and there's some documentation available on it, too.
Our guest is Jack Anderson. Let's go to San Mateo. Hi.
Yes, good evening. What I wanted to ask you, Jack, is did John Kennedy order the CIA to look into assassinating Castro and therefore seal his own doom, or was it, in fact, the CIA acting on their own?
The plot began when Dwight Eisenhower was president. It began with Allen Dulles, who was then the CIA chief, and he proposed the liquidation of Castro in December of 1959. But the actual attempts occurred after the Bay of Pigs, and after John Kennedy had said publicly, or maybe it was privately, but it was reported publicly, that he'd like to break the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. What he actually did do was place his brother in charge. He put the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, as his personal watchdog over the CIA. And in that capacity, in May of 1962, Robert Kennedy approved the plot to kill Castro and went ahead with it. I don't know that John Kennedy knew anything about it, but it just is not credible to me. It makes no sense to me that Robert Kennedy would not tell his brother. So I rather expect that his brother did know what was going on.
Farmington Hills, Michigan. Hi.
Hello there. Jack, in your program aired recently, you brought out the fact that Oswald wasn't picked up until the tip came saying that he was at the Dallas movie theater after the shooting of the police officer. Was that an anonymous tip?
I don't know.
Okay.
And I'm not even certain that he killed the police officer. There are those who don't believe that he was guilty of that. But all I know really is what was reported in the press at the time on that. I don't know just who exactly how that came about and why it came about and whether there was anything conspiratorial involved. The only thing that I do know is that the Mafia had intended to eliminate Lee Harvey Oswald, and the police got to him first. So clearly the Mafia did not know he was going to go to a theater instead of coming home that night, or that day.
According to the Warren Commission, Oswald fled the book depository.
That's right.
And killed the officer with a pistol?
He could have. That's what the Warren Commission believes. It's never been proved. And it may be true. And it may also be true that Lee Harvey Oswald was telling the truth when he told the police, because this is what he did tell the police, that he had been set up, that he was a patsy. Maybe he was a patsy. My sources say that he was. Just exactly whether he actually pulled the trigger of that fatal gun or whether some others pulled the trigger and left the gun and made it look like he did it. These are things that I really don't know. The only thing that I know is that the plot to kill Castro backfired, that the people who had been sent to kill Castro wound up going after John F. Kennedy. That's what I know, and I know that from sources who are entirely credible, sources who participated in the actual hearings, and I know, too, that this was the conclusion of the CIA, and I know the CIA reported it to Lyndon Johnson, and I know that Lyndon Johnson believed the report.
Fascinating, controversial information. Our guest is Jack Anderson. We'll be back right after these messages.